The streets were still warm. That is what stunned the first investigators when they arrived. The fires in the hearths had burned down only hours before. Food still sat on tables. A child's sandal lay near a doorway. Tools rested where workers had set them down mid-task, as if someone had simply pressed pause on an entire civilization and walked away. Except nobody walked away. A thriving city of tens of thousands of people, merchants, priests, soldiers, mothers, children, had ceased to exist between one sunset and the next. No bodies, no mass graves, no signs of battle or siege, no warning written in stone, just silence, stretching across streets that had once roared with life. What force on earth can erase a city overnight and leave behind no trace of why? To understand what happened here, you need to picture this city at the height of its power. This was not a remote village clinging to the edge of some forgotten desert. This was a metropolis, a center of trade, culture, and political authority that dominated the surrounding region for centuries. Its markets drew merchants from distant lands. Its architecture rivaled anything the ancient world had built. Generations of families had lived and died within its walls, and they believed, as successful civilizations always do, that their city would stand forever. The time period, somewhere between the late ancient era and the edge of what we now call history. Exact dates remain disputed because what came after this city's disappearance was precisely that. Nothing. No successor state carried its records forward. No neighboring kingdom wrote down what they witnessed. The city simply ended, and the world moved on as if it had never existed at all. Historians who later uncovered its ruins described a peculiar sensation, not the ruin of destruction, but the silence of abandonment. Like a stage after the actors have left, the set still standing, the costume still hung, the script still open on the table. But here is the question that has haunted researchers for decades. How does a city this large, this organized, this deeply rooted in the earth, simply vanish in a single night? The answer is more disturbing than any earthquake or invasion. And it begins with a secret that the city's own leaders worked hard to keep buried. For years before the disappearance, things were not what they seemed. On the surface, the city projected an image of total stability. Public ceremonies continued on schedule. The markets stayed open. The walls were patrolled. Grain reserves were reported as adequate. The priests performed their rituals at the temples with the same rhythms they had followed for generations. If you had walked through this city's main market street just 6 months before its end, you would have seen nothing unusual. Merchants haggling, children running between the stalls, the smell of bread, of spices, of animals, of a living civilization confident in its own permanence. But behind closed doors, inside the administrative chambers where the most powerful men met in the early hours before dawn, something had begun to fracture. The city was built on a resource. Every great civilization is, and this city's resource, whether it was water flowing from a great river, a rare mineral mined from the surrounding land, a strategic trade route connecting 2 continents, or agricultural land that fed tens of thousands, had begun to fail. Not visibly, not yet, but the people at the very top knew. They had known for some time. The reports were coming in from the engineers, from the surveyors, from the men who measured and mapped and calculated. The numbers did not lie. Here is the first thing that should stop you cold. They chose not to tell anyone. Instead, the ruling class began moving quietly. Wealth was transferred in secret. Gold, sacred objects, key administrative documents, anything of lasting value. Trusted relatives were quietly relocated to outlying settlements under cover of night, told only that it was a temporary arrangement, a precaution, nothing to worry about. Stay calm. Keep working. Everything is fine. Meanwhile, the ordinary people of the city continued their lives in total ignorance. They paid their taxes. They sent their children to work in the fields and the workshops. They offered prayers at the temples and trusted that the structures of power which had governed their world since birth would continue to protect them. That was the deal, after all. Obedience in exchange for safety. Work in exchange for security. Trust in exchange for truth. They had no idea those structures were already hollow. The evacuation plan was drawn up over weeks. We know this because of what the archaeologists found. A fragment of an administrative clay tablet buried in the collapsed remains of what had been the city's central records office. On it, painstakingly translated over years of scholarly work, names, routes, supply quantities, pre-positioned resources at designated locations outside the city walls. This was not improvised panic. This was organized abandonment. The powerful had their exit arranged and waiting long before the ordinary citizens had any idea that an exit might be needed. Then came the night that changed everything. Survivors. And there were some, though their accounts only surfaced centuries later in fragments, copied by monks into manuscripts that sat unstudied in monastery libraries for cost. Centuries more. Described a sound before anything else. Not an explosion, not the crack of siege weapons. Something low and continuous, like the earth itself, drawing a long breath inward. Some described it as a vibration felt through the soles of the feet before it was ever heard. Through the ears. Then the water changed. The city's water supply, the river, the aquifer, the canal network that the entire civilization depended on, either failed catastrophically or became suddenly, lethally wrong. Accounts describe people falling ill within hours of drinking from sources that had sustained them all their lives. Confusion spreading through the residential districts. People calling out to neighbors, gathering in the streets, looking for answers from anyone in authority. And then, cutting through the rising panic, a single announcement from a city herald at the main crossroads. The city was being evacuated. But here is the part that was never meant to be discovered. The herald who made that announcement did not know that the leaders were already gone. He was reading from an instruction left for him in advance, part of the plan that had been prepared weeks earlier to be deployed at the moment of crisis. By the time his voice rang through those streets, the men who wrote his script were already miles away in the darkness, moving along pre-planned routes with their families and their gold and their sealed records. For the majority of the population, there was only chaos. In the darkness and the confusion, with the water supply compromised, the leadership already gone, and no organized system for mass evacuation, the population scattered however they could. Some fled into the desert with whatever they could carry. Some moved toward the nearest river, hoping the contamination, or the failure, was only local. Some, and this is the detail that haunts researchers most, simply sat down in the streets and could not move fast enough, or were too elderly, or too young, or too overwhelmed to process what was happening in time to survive it. By morning, the city was empty, or close enough to empty that those who came to look in the days that followed saw only silence, and the eerie remnants of lives interrupted mid-sentence. A child's sandal by a doorway, a merchant's scales still balanced, a fire burned down to cold ash, a city of tens of thousands reduced overnight to a monument to what happens when the people who hold power decide that their survival matters more than the people they were supposed to lead. The leaders who escaped settled elsewhere. They rebuilt, quietly, in new locations. They spoke carefully among themselves about what had happened, and more carefully still, about what would be said publicly. And somewhere in those early days of their new, comfortable lives, they made a collective decision that history would not record them as the men who abandoned their own city in the dark. So they did something even more deliberate than fleeing. They erased the city from memory. Maps were altered. Trade records were adjusted to remove references to its markets and its merchants. The city's name stopped appearing in administrative documents. Cultural and religious references to its temples and its gods were quietly phased out. Within 2 generations, the official recorded history of the region made no mention of a great metropolis that had once stood at its center. It was gone, not just physically consumed by desert and time, but deliberately, methodically removed from the story that the powerful chose to tell about themselves. Centuries later, when archaeologists first uncovered the site, they were baffled by what they did not find. There were no weapon marks on the walls, no evidence of plague that would explain total population collapse, no volcanic ash layer, no flood deposits, just structures, objects, and an overwhelming absence of people. It was the clay tablets, painstakingly translated over years, that finally told the truth. And the truth was this: the city did not vanish. It was abandoned. And it was abandoned by design, by the very people who had promised to protect it. Why was this covered up? Because the alternative was admission of guilt. The leadership class that survived carried enormous power in their new locations. To acknowledge what they had done would have been to invite rebellion, justice, perhaps execution. So they chose silence. And silence, when practiced by the powerful and the literate, becomes history. But here is what this story is really about. It is not about an ancient civilization. It is about the gap between those who hold information and those who are left in the dark. That gap, that deliberate silence, is not ancient history. It is the oldest trick in the Book of Power, and it has been repeated in every era since. The people of that city trusted their leaders completely. They built their lives within a system that promised safety in exchange for obedience. And when that system failed, the people who ran it protected themselves first, and the rest of their world second. What they left behind was not just ruins. It was a lesson written in empty streets and cold hearths and a child's sandal by a doorway. Trust is not a structure. It must be earned, and power, when unchecked, will always, eventually, choose itself. The city has no name that we are certain of. The people who live there have no individual voices left in the historical record. They are known only by what they left behind. The tools, the pottery, the faint markings on walls that suggest a community that believed it would endure. They were wrong. And the men who made them wrong lived out their days in comfort, in their names preserved in the very records they controlled. If you never knew this story existed, you are not alone. This is exactly the kind of history that those in power prefer stays buried, because it raises uncomfortable questions about what we are willing to accept and from whom. If that disturbed you even slightly, hit like right now. Subscribe if you want more of the hidden histories that the official record tried to erase. And drop a comment below. Tell me, what surprised you most about this story? Because here is the final thought I will leave you with. Somewhere beneath the earth, in a city with no name, the hearth fires finally went cold, and nobody in power came back to explain why.